Saigon, 1968, Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The heat was suffocating, the kind that made breathing feel like work. American soldiers moved through the base with the exhausted rhythm of men who'd stopped believing the war would end. And in a corner of the cargo area, away from official operations, Turi, Baggs, Leslie sat on a metal crate with his hands trembling. Baggs was a pilot, not military, independent contractor. The kind of man who'd found a niche in the chaos of war, flying supplies that didn't appear on manifests and cargo that no one officially acknowledged. For 2 years, he'd been making runs from Vietnam to the United States, carrying something far more valuable than military equipment: heroin, pure, uncut, hidden in the coffins of American soldiers being sent home for burial. And now, for the first time since he'd started working for Frank Lucas, Baggs couldn't do it anymore. Frank arrived at the cargo area 30 minutes later. He'd flown in from Harlem specifically for this conversation, which told Baggs everything he needed to know about how seriously Frank took the problem. Frank Lucas didn't make international trips for small issues. Baggs looked up as Frank approached. Frank was 37 years old, wearing civilian clothes that somehow looked more authoritative than any uniform. There was something about Frank's presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Quiet power, the kind you don't argue with. "We have a problem," Frank asked, not a question, a statement inviting confirmation. Baggs nodded slowly. "I can't do this anymore, Frank." Silence. Frank didn't react immediately, just studied Baggs the way you might study a machine that had started, making unfamiliar sounds, looking for the source of the malfunction. "Why?" One word, but Baggs heard all the other questions underneath it. Why now? Why after 2 years? Why when everything's working perfectly? Baggs stood up, paced a few steps, came back. "Those coffins, they're real soldiers, real families waiting. Every time I load them, every time I fly them home, I think about their mothers, their wives, their kids. And I think about what I'm putting in there with them." Frank's expression didn't change. "You knew what you were doing when you started." "I know, but knowing something and living with it are different things." Frank looked past Baggs toward the cargo area where several flag-draped coffins waited for transport. American flags, boys who'd died thousands of miles from home, and inside some of those coffins, hidden in the bodies themselves or in the coffin linings, pure heroin worth millions on the streets of Harlem. It was brilliant, really. Customs didn't search military coffins. Couldn't, wouldn't. There was too much respect, too much bureaucracy, too much political sensitivity. The coffins moved through every checkpoint untouched. Perfect cover, perfect system. And now his pilot was developing a conscience. Frank turned back to Baggs. "What do you want?" "I want out, find someone else. I can't carry dead boys and drugs in the same cargo hold anymore. I just can't." Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening. "Baggs, you understand what you're asking. You understand what you know, where you've been, what you've seen." Baggs felt his stomach tighten. He'd thought about this. Of course he'd thought about this. Men didn't just walk away from Frank Lucas's operation. Not with the knowledge Baggs carried, not with the exposure that represented. "I'm not asking to walk away clean," Baggs said quietly. "I'm asking to stop doing this specific thing. I'll fly other cargo, I'll do other work, just not the coffins. Please." Frank studied him. Baggs could see the calculation happening behind Frank's eyes, the risk assessment, the cost-benefit analysis. The question of whether killing Baggs or replacing him created more problems than it solved. Finally, Frank nodded. "Okay." Baggs felt relief wash over him. "Okay, okay, you're out, but you stay in Vietnam. You work other routes for me, food supplies, medical equipment. Legitimate cargo. You do that for 6 months, prove you can keep quiet about what you know, then we talk about you going home." It wasn't freedom, but it was mercy. In Frank Lucas's world, that was more than most men got. Baggs nodded quickly. "Thank you, I won't." "Don't," Frank cut him off. "Don't thank me, and don't make me regret this." Frank walked away without another word. Baggs watched him go, feeling something between relief and shame. He'd kept his conscience, but he'd also just realized how trapped he really was. What Baggs didn't know was that Frank's okay hadn't been mercy at all. It had been efficiency, because Frank Lucas didn't stop using military coffins. He just stopped using Baggs. To understand what Frank did next, you need to understand who he was before Vietnam, before Blue Magic, before he built an empire that would eventually make him the most successful drug trafficker in Harlem's history. Frank Lucas was born in North Carolina in 1930, poverty so deep it felt ancestral. By the time he was 12, he'd watched the Ku Klux Klan tie his cousin to a tree as a warning. not murder, just reminder, a lesson in powerlessness. That night Frank made himself a promise, never again, never powerless, never small, whatever it took. He came to Harlem in 1946 and spent 20 years learning, first from small-time operators, then from Bumpy Johnson, the only man in Harlem who understood that real power wasn't about violence. It was about systems, about discipline, about thinking 3 steps ahead. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank inherited territory and a question: what do you do when you're free to build whatever you want? Most of. Bumpy's lieutenants stayed local, worked with the Italian families who controlled most of Harlem's drug trade, accepted the markup, accepted the arrangement. Frank did something different. He went to the source. Vietnam, 1968. While America watched the war on television, Frank saw opportunity. Not in the fighting, in the infrastructure, in the chaos that made certain things invisible, in the reality that the U.S. military was operating a massive transportation network between Southeast Asia and the United States, and that network had gaps. Frank connected with suppliers in the Golden Triangle, found heroin so pure it made everything on American streets look like poison, arranged purchases that cut out every middleman, every Italian family, every traditional channel. Blue magic, that's what he called it, because it was blue. Because it was pure, because it was magic compared to anything else available. But purity meant nothing if you couldn't transport it, and that's where the coffins came in. The idea wasn't originally Frank's. He'd heard rumors, stories about military personnel smuggling small amounts of drugs home in various ways, but Frank thought bigger. Why smuggle small amounts when you could move bulk? Why risk detection with living carriers when you had thousands of dead soldiers providing perfect cover? It was brilliant. It was horrible. It was both things at once, and Frank understood that. He wasn't naive about what he was doing. He was using the bodies of American soldiers who died in combat to flood American streets with drugs that would destroy American communities. The moral weight of that decision should have been crushing, for most people it would have been, but Frank had learned something important from Bumpy Johnson. If you let morality dictate business decisions, you'd lose to people who didn't, and Frank Lucas wasn't built to lose. He recruited Baggs through military contacts. Baggs was ex-Air Force, dishonorably discharged for reasons he didn't talk about, flying independent cargo runs for various contractors. He was skilled, discreet. And most importantly, he needed money badly enough to not ask too many questions. For 2 years, it worked perfectly. Baggs flew monthly runs, coffins loaded in Saigon, transported to the United States, received by Frank's people at military bases, processed and distributed. The purity of blue magic made it immediately popular. The supply chain made it reliably available. Frank was making $1 million a week, and then Baggs developed a conscience. After Frank left the cargo area that day, he spent the next 48 hours solving the problem Baggs had created. Not by killing Baggs, that would have been simple but messy. Military contractors going missing in Vietnam attracted attention, questions, investigations. Frank needed a better solution. He needed someone who wouldn't develop moral complications. Someone who understood that in war, bodies were just cargo. Someone who'd seen enough death that a few more coffins wouldn't register emotionally. He found that person in Master Sergeant Jack Harper. Harper was 38, 20 years in the Army, working mortuary affairs at Tan Son Nhut. His job was processing remains, preparing bodies for transport home, filling out paperwork, coordinating with families. It was grim work that required emotional distance, which Harper had developed extensively. More importantly, Harper had gambling debts, the kind that followed you across continents, the kind that made men receptive to opportunities they might otherwise ignore. Frank approached Harper carefully, not with the full truth, but with enough truth. He needed someone who could ensure certain coffins moved through certain channels without excessive inspection. Someone who could coordinate timing and paperwork. Someone who could make the system work smoothly. Harper listened, asked practical questions, never asked moral ones, and when Frank offered enough money to clear Harper's debts plus a substantial monthly payment, Harper agreed. The system became even more efficient. Harper knew exactly which coffins were being used, knew the schedules, knew which inspectors were less thorough, knew how to route things to minimize risk. What had been risky under Baggs became nearly invisible under Harper. Blue magic flooded into the United States in quantities that dwarfed anything Frank had moved before. The Italian families noticed, tried to find the source, couldn't, because Frank's supply chain was completely separate from traditional channels. He'd built something they couldn't penetrate. Frank became rich, not just successful. Wealthy beyond anything Harlem had seen. He bought property, businesses, cars, clothes, that chinchilla coat he'd wear to the Ollie Frazier fight, the coat that would eventually help the FBI identify him. But he never forgot Bags, never forgot that conversation in the cargo area, never forgot the look on Bags's face when he said, "I can't carry dead boys and drugs in the same cargo." Hold anymore, because Bags had said something true, something Frank had pushed away but couldn't quite erase. Using soldiers' coffins wasn't just illegal. It was a specific kind of violation, a desecration. It took men who died for their country and turned them into mules for poison. Frank justified it to himself in various ways. The soldiers were already dead. Nothing he did could hurt them. The families would never know. The heroin was going to enter the country somehow anyway. He wasn't creating the demand, just meeting it more efficiently. But late at night, sometimes, Frank would think about those coffins, about the mothers waiting at airports, about the honor guards and the folded flags and the grief, and about what was hidden in those flag-draped boxes. He pushed those thoughts away, because feeling them would mean stopping, and stopping would mean losing everything he'd built, losing power, becoming small again, becoming the kid from North Carolina who watched the Klan tie his cousin to a tree and couldn't do anything about it. So Frank kept moving, kept building, kept expanding, and tried not to think about Bags sitting on that metal crate with his hands shaking. 5 years later, 1973, Frank Lucas was arrested. The FBI had been building a case since the Ollie Frazier fight in 1971. Agent Richie Roberts had noticed that chinchilla coat and started pulling threads, found the operation, found the suppliers, found the network. They didn't find the coffins immediately. That part stayed hidden for years. Harper had been too careful, the system too compartmentalized, but eventually, during Frank's cooperation with authorities to reduce his sentence, pieces of the truth came out. When prosecutors learned about the coffins, there was a specific kind of revulsion. They'd seen everything: drug trafficking, violence, corruption, but using dead soldiers to smuggle heroin hit differently. It wasn't just illegal, it felt un-American in a way that transcended normal criminal activity. Frank was sentenced to 70 years, eventually reduced through cooperation to 15. He served time, got released. Tried to rebuild a life, and everywhere he went for the rest of his life, people asked him the same question: how could you do that? How could you use soldiers' coffins? Frank had various answers, sometimes defensive, sometimes philosophical, sometimes just silent, but there was one answer he never gave publicly, never admitted except in the privacy of his own thoughts. Bags was right. That's what Frank thought when he was alone, when the interviews were over and the documentaries were finished and the glamorization stopped, when it was just an old man remembering the choices that defined his life. Bags was right. Those coffins were real soldiers, real families waiting, and what Frank put in there with them was more than just illegal cargo. It was a betrayal of something fundamental. Frank Lucas built an empire by being smarter than everyone else, by thinking 3 steps ahead, by making hard decisions without hesitation, by separating emotion from strategy. But that conversation with Bags in the Saigon cargo area showed him something he spent the rest of his life trying to forget. There's a difference between being emotionally disciplined and being emotionally dead, and somewhere in his rise from North Carolina poverty to Harlem power, Frank had crossed that line. He'd become the kind of man who could hear another man say, "I can't carry dead boys and drugs in the same cargo hold anymore," and respond not with empathy but with calculation, not with understanding but with replacement. That's what made him legendary. His ability to solve problems without emotional interference, to see situations purely strategically, to make decisions that would haunt most people's dreams without losing a night of sleep. But it's also what made him hunted, because that same coldness that made him successful made him reckless, made him wear a chinchilla coat to the fight of the century, made him visible when he should have stayed invisible, made him legendary when he should have stayed quiet, and it's what made him, in his final years, something sadder than either legendary or hunted. It made him haunted, haunted by Bags's trembling hands, by the coffins moving through air bases, by the mothers waiting at airports, by the young men who died in Vietnam and were violated again in death by becoming part of Frank's supply chain. The Vietnam War ended, blue magic disappeared. The empire collapsed. Frank Lucas became an old man with stories people paid him to tell, but those stories never quite captured the truth. The truth was quieter, more human, more complicated. The truth was that Frank Lucas heard a man say he couldn't do something anymore because his conscience wouldn't let him. And instead of respecting that, Frank replaced him with someone who had less conscience, because that's what the operation required, that's what success demanded. Baggs stayed in Vietnam working other routes for Frank until 1975, then he disappeared. Frank never knew what happened to him, whether he went home, whether he got clean, whether he ever forgave himself for the 2 years he spent flying those coffins. Frank hoped Baggs found peace, because Frank never did. The empire was gone, the money was gone, the power was gone, but the memory of that conversation in the cargo area stayed. The sound of Baggs's voice saying, "I just can't." And the knowledge that Frank's response was, "That's fine, I'll find someone who can." That's the real story of what Frank Lucas did when his Vietnam pilot refused to fly the coffins. Not the dramatic version, not the Hollywood version, the human version. He replaced him, efficiently, strategically, successfully, and he spent the rest of his life knowing that the thing that made him legendary, his ability to solve problems without moral hesitation, was the same thing that made him hunted, both by the FBI and by the memory of every choice he'd made to get there. Baggs was right. Those were real soldiers, real families waiting. Frank Lucas knew it then. He knows it now. He knew it every day in between, but he did it anyway, because that's who he was, a man who'd promised himself he'd never be powerless again. And who'd paid for that promise with pieces of his humanity he didn't even realize he was trading until they were gone. The coffins flew, the operation succeeded, the empire rose, and somewhere in all of that success, Frank Lucas became the kind of man who could look at another human being's moral breaking point and see nothing but a logistical problem to solve. That's what made him legendary. That's what made him hunted. And that's what made him, in the end, just a man carrying weight he could never quite set down.